They laughed when Marcus built walls 3 feet thick and stockpiled enough firewood to heat a hotel, calling him paranoid, crazy, a doomsday fool living in fantasy, until the worst blizzard in a century buried their town in ice and darkness, trapping everyone in freezing homes with no power, no heat, and no way out, everyone except the mountain man they mocked. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning sun barely crept over the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies, casting long shadows across the valley below. Marcus Chen stood on the porch of his cabin, a steaming mug of coffee in his calloused hands, watching the world wake up beneath him. The air was sharp, clean, biting at his lungs in that way that reminded him he was still alive. 52 years old now, with a beard more silver than black, and lines etched deep around his eyes from squinting at distant horizons. He didn't look like the MIT-trained engineer he once was. He looked like what 15 years of mountain solitude does to a man. Weathered, hard, self-contained. His cabin sat at 7,800 feet, tucked into a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest. It wasn't the rustic shack people imagined when they heard mountain cabin. This was a fortress disguised as a home. The walls were constructed from 12-inch logs, insulated with spray foam, wrapped in house wrap, then sided again. Triple-pane windows, minimal but strategically placed. A metal roof pitched steep enough to shed snow without assistance. Solar panels angled perfectly to catch what little winter sun the mountains offered. 2 backup generators in a weatherproof shed. A root cellar dug 8 feet deep into bedrock. A well with a hand pump backup. Propane tanks buried and protected. Firewood stacked in cords that would make a lumberyard jealous. Marcus had built it all himself over the course of 8 years, 1 board, 1 nail, 1 system at a time. People in Pinewood Valley, the small town 40 minutes down the winding mountain road, thought he was insane. They whispered about him at the general store, at the diner, at Sunday services he never attended. The crazy mountain man, the hermit, the paranoid engineer who lost his mind. They didn't know the half of it. They didn't know that on a rainy night in 2007, Marcus's wife Sarah and his 6-year-old son Daniel had been driving home from Daniel's soccer practice when a drunk driver crossed the median on Highway 36 outside Boulder. They didn't know that Marcus had been working late at his engineering firm, chasing a promotion he thought mattered, missing dinner for the 4th time that week. They didn't know he got the call at 9:47 p.m., or that he'd arrived at the hospital to find his entire world had ended while he was optimizing load-bearing calculations for a corporate office building nobody needed. They didn't know that for 2 years after, he'd tried to keep going, tried to pretend work mattered, tried to exist in a world that had taken everything. They didn't know about the pills, the therapy that didn't work, the mornings he couldn't get out of bed, the nights he couldn't sleep at all. They didn't know that one day he'd simply walked away from it all, the career, the house in the suburbs, the life that felt like a museum of pain. He'd bought this land for $32,000 from a widow who was tired of paying taxes on property her late husband had planned to retire on. He'd lived in a tent that first summer, then a small camper, while he began building. At first, people had been curious, even friendly, but as the cabin grew more fortified, more elaborate, more serious, the friendliness turned to suspicion, then to mockery. Marcus took a long sip of his coffee and watched a hawk circle over the valley. He didn't care what they thought. He'd learned the hard way that the world could take everything from you in an instant, and the only person you could count on was yourself. So, he'd built a place where he'd never be caught unprepared again, where he controlled every variable, where nothing could surprise him. The weather forecast crackled from the radio inside. He'd been monitoring it for 3 days now. A massive storm system was building over the Pacific, pulling Arctic air down from Canada, gathering moisture as it moved. The meteorologists were calling it significant and potentially historic. Marcus had seen the satellite imagery, had run his own calculations based on pressure systems and temperature gradients. His engineering mind saw patterns others missed. This wasn't going to be just another winter storm. This was going to be a monster. He drained his coffee and went inside to check his supplies one more time. The interior of the cabin was sparse but functional. Open-concept living area with a massive stone fireplace, kitchen along one wall, bedroom loft above, and a small bathroom with composting toilet and a shower fed by a tankless propane water heater. Everything had a backup, and every backup had a backup. Shelves lined with canned goods, dried beans, rice, flour, salt. A chest freezer powered by solar, filled with meat from the deer he'd taken in October. 50 gallons of water stored in food-grade barrels, plus the well. Medical supplies that would make a small clinic jealous. Tools for every possible need. He made a mental list. Firewood stacked and covered, check. Generator fuel topped off. Propane tanks full. Solar batteries charged. Food stores more than adequate. Communications equipment functional. Snow removal equipment maintained and ready. Backup clothing dry and accessible. First aid stocked. Everything was ready. It always was. By noon, Marcus decided to make the drive down to Pinewood Valley. He didn't need much, just wanted to grab a few things before the storm hit. Fresh vegetables, maybe some coffee, a couple of books from the library. It was a 40-minute drive down a winding mountain road that he maintained himself for the first 3 miles until it connected with the county road. His truck, a 2012 Ford F-250 with a plow attachment, handled it easily. Pinewood Valley was the kind of town that tourists drove through on their way to ski resorts and never stopped. Population 843, if you counted the dogs. One main street with a general store, a diner, a gas station, a post office, and a combination hardware store and feed supply. The library was in the community center, which also housed the volunteer fire department. There was a small school that served grades K through 8. High schoolers bussed to the next town over. One bar called the Antler that served as the unofficial town hall where everyone gathered to complain about property taxes and out-of-state transplants. Marcus parked his truck in front of Miller's General Store, the only place in town that sold groceries. As he walked toward the entrance, he could feel eyes on him. A couple of women stopped their conversation on the sidewalk. 2 men in Carhartt jackets leaning against a pickup truck nudged each other. Inside, the store smelled like old wood and coffee. Marcus grabbed a basket and moved through the aisles efficiently. Carrots, potatoes, onions, apples, a bag of coffee beans, a few candy bars he didn't need but liked anyway. At the counter, Sally Miller rang him up with the same tight smile she'd been giving him for years. "Storm coming," she said, not quite making eye contact. "Yep," Marcus replied, handing her cash. "You stocked up enough up there?" There was something in her tone, not quite concern, more like morbid curiosity. "I'm fine." Behind him, someone snorted. Marcus didn't turn around. He knew the voice. Brett Holloway, 34 years old, real estate developer from Denver, who'd moved to Pinewood Valley 3 years ago with big plans to revitalize the town by building luxury vacation homes. He'd married a local girl, Amber, who'd been 2 years behind Marcus's wife in high school, not that Marcus knew that until someone had mentioned it once. "Must be nice," Brett said loudly, "living in your bunker without a care in the world. The rest of us have actual lives to worry about." Marcus took his bag from Sally and turned. Brett stood there with his arms crossed, wearing an expensive puffy jacket and a smirk. Amber stood beside him, looking uncomfortable. "Just prepared," Marcus said evenly. "Prepared," Brett repeated, drawing out the word. "Man, you've been preparing for the apocalypse for what, 15 years? Newsflash, it's not coming. You're just hiding from life up there." A few other people in the store had stopped to watch. Marcus recognized most of them. Tom Brennan, who owned the gas station. Lisa Chen, no relation, who ran the post office. Old Henry Walsh, who'd lived in the valley for 76 years and remembered when there were only 12 families total. "Brett, leave it alone," Amber said quietly, touching his arm. Brett shrugged her off. "No, seriously, I want to understand. What are you so afraid of, Marcus? What's the worst that's going to happen? A snowstorm? We live in Colorado. It snows. We deal with it. We don't build concrete bunkers and act like the world's ending." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. the anger he'd learned to compress into something small and dense. "I'm not afraid of anything," he said. "I just believe in self-sufficiency." "Self-sufficiency?" Brett laughed. "That's a fancy word for antisocial. You know what I think? I think you're so caught up in your prep-per fantasy that you've forgotten how to be part of a community. People help each other out down here. We don't need some paranoid hermit telling us we're doing it wrong." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. Brett was taller, younger, softer around the middle from easy living. He had the kind of confidence that came from never having the world collapse beneath him, from never having to dig through the wreckage of everything he loved. "I hope you're right," Marcus said finally. "I hope the storm's nothing. I hope you're all fine." He walked out before Brett could respond. Behind him, he heard someone say, "Jesus, Brett, why do you always have to poke the bear?" And Brett's defensive reply, "What? Somebody needs to call out his BS." Marcus loaded his groceries into the truck and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, breathing slowly. This was why he avoided town. This was why he stayed on his mountain. Down here, people thought preparedness was paranoia, thought self-reliance was antisocial, thought that because nothing bad had happened yet, nothing bad ever would. They didn't understand that the world didn't care about your plans, your comfort, your expectations. It would take everything when you weren't looking, and all your community and neighborliness wouldn't mean a damn thing when the lights went out and the temperature dropped and you were alone in the dark with no heat and no food and no idea what to do. He started the truck and drove home. That evening, Marcus sat in his loft with a book, but he wasn't reading. The weather radio murmured updates in the background. The storm had intensified faster than predicted. It was now classified as a major winter event, possibly a bomb cyclone. Expected snowfall for the region, 3 to 5 feet. Wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour. Whiteout conditions. Temperatures dropping to 15 below zero. Wind chill making it feel like 40 below. Travel not recommended. Residents advised to stock up on supplies and stay home. Marcus looked out his window at Pinewood Valley far below, lights twinkling in the growing darkness. He wondered if they were paying attention. Probably not. They'd lived through storms before. They'd be fine, they thought. He hoped they were right. Despite everything, despite Brett's smugness and the town's mockery, he didn't wish harm on anyone. He'd just learned not to trust hope. Hope didn't keep you warm. Hope didn't fill your belly. Hope didn't bring back the dead. Preparation did. Control did. Self-reliance did. He checked the forecast one more time. Storm arrival, 18 to 24 hours. Marcus went through his mental checklist again, then physically walked through the cabin, testing systems, verifying readiness. Solar panels clear of debris, check. Generator serviced and tested, check. Firewood accessible even in deep snow, check. Water lines insulated and heat-taped, check. Food stores inventoried, check. Medical supplies organized, check. Communication equipment charged, check. Snow removal equipment fueled and ready, check. He was ready. He was always ready. Outside, the wind was picking up, moving through the pines with a sound like distant whispers. The temperature had already dropped 5 degrees since sunset. The first high clouds were moving in, thin and fast, the leading edge of what was coming. Marcus built a fire in the stone fireplace, more for the comfort than the heat. The cabin's insulation and passive solar design kept it warm enough, but there was something primal about a fire, something that spoke to a deeper part of the brain that remembered when fire was the only thing between humans and the cold dark. He sat in his chair, the same chair he'd sat in for 15 years, and let his mind wander back. He tried not to do this often, tried to keep the memories locked away, but sometimes they escaped anyway. Daniel's laugh, high and bright, the kind of laugh that made everyone around him smile. Sarah's hand in his, walking through the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. The weight of Daniel in his arms, already asleep, as Marcus carried him from the car to his bed. The way Sarah hummed while cooking, off-key but happy. The plans they'd made, family vacations, Daniel's college fund, growing old together, all of it gone in an instant. All of it reduced to memory and regret. Marcus had built this cabin not just to survive storms, but to survive grief. Every log he'd placed, every system he'd installed, every backup plan he'd created was a way of saying, never again. Never again would he be helpless. Never again would he depend on things he couldn't control. Never again would he be caught unprepared. But late at night, in moments like this, he wondered if he'd built a fortress or a prison. The wind gusted harder, rattling something outside. Marcus stood and looked out the window. The clouds were thicker now, moving fast, blotting out the stars. The temperature display on his weather station read 28 degrees and dropping. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow it begins. He banked the fire, checked the locks on the doors. Not that anyone would be coming, not that he needed locks, but routine mattered, and climbed to his loft. Through the skylight above his bed, he could see the last few stars disappearing behind the advancing storm front. He thought about Brett Holloway and his fancy modern house with its floor-to-ceiling windows and radiant floor heating powered by the grid. He thought about Sally Miller in her apartment above the store, probably watching TV, unconcerned. He thought about all of them down in the valley, assuming everything would be fine because everything had always been fine. And he thought about what his therapist had told him years ago, before he'd stopped going. Marcus, you can't control the world. You can only control how you respond to it, and right now, you're responding by trying to hide from it. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe this whole thing, the cabin, the preparation, the isolation, was just an elaborate way of hiding. But hiding had kept him alive when everything else had failed. Hiding had given him something to do with his hands and his mind when grief threatened to swallow him whole. Hiding had become his life. The wind howled and Marcus closed his eyes. Ready or not, the storm was coming. And for better or worse, he was the only one who truly was. The first snowflakes began falling at 4:37 a.m. Marcus was already awake, standing on his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, watching them spiral down through the beam of his flashlight. They were small, hard, wind-driven, the kind of snow that meant business. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees, and the wind was gusting at 25 miles per hour. This was just the beginning. By sunrise, which barely qualified as such under the thick grey clouds, visibility had dropped to less than a quarter mile. The snow was falling steadily now, accumulating at a rate of about an inch per hour. Marcus watched from his window as the valley below began to disappear under a white blanket. The lights of Pinewood Valley still glowed faintly through the growing storm, tiny pinpricks of civilization that seemed suddenly very fragile. He went about his morning routine with the same methodical precision he applied to everything: coffee, oatmeal with dried fruit, checking systems. The solar panels were already covered with snow, but he'd expected that. The batteries were fully charged, and he had the generators as backup. The cabin was holding steady at 68 degrees without any active heating, just passive solar gain and insulation doing their job. He'd light a fire later when things got colder. By 10 a.m., Pinewood Valley had disappeared entirely. The world had shrunk to just Marcus's clearing, and even that was becoming difficult to see through the horizontal snow. The wind had picked up significantly, howling around the cabin's corners, testing the construction. Marcus listened to it with a critical ear, noting how the structure responded. Solid. No whistling through gaps, no rattling windows, no concerning creaks. The cabin was doing exactly what he'd built it to do. The weather radio crackled with increasingly urgent updates. The storm had intensified into a full-bomb cyclone, pressure dropping faster than meteorologists had predicted. Snowfall rates had increased to 3 to 4 inches per hour in some areas. Wind gusts were now expected to reach 80 to 90 miles per hour. The governor had declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was being mobilized. All travel was forbidden. Marcus wondered if Pinewood Valley was paying attention now. He spent the morning reading, maintaining the fire, monitoring weather updates. Around noon, the power went out in the valley below. He could tell because the faint glow that had been visible through the storm suddenly vanished. He checked his own systems, solar batteries at 87%, generator 1 ready for activation if needed, generator 2 in reserve, heat steady, water flowing, everything nominal. Down in the valley, he knew, things were probably getting uncomfortable. Most of the homes in Pinewood Valley had been built in the 1960s and 70s, before modern insulation standards. They relied on electric heat pumps or natural gas furnaces with electric igniters and blowers. Without power, they'd start losing heat quickly. Some people had fireplaces, but most were decorative gas units that also required electricity. A few had wood stoves, but Marcus knew from his trips to town that most people only kept a decorative amount of firewood on hand, maybe enough for a romantic evening, not enough to heat a home for days. By 2 p.m., the snow depth was already approaching 18 inches, and it showed no sign of stopping. The wind was ferocious now, creating drifts that were 4 to 5 feet high in places. Marcus's clearing was filling in, the paths he'd shoveled that morning already buried again. He wasn't concerned. He had a snowblower, a plow attachment for his ATV, and enough fuel to clear snow for weeks if necessary. But there was no point in clearing anything yet. The storm was just getting started. He made himself lunch, venison stew from a jar he'd canned last fall, with fresh bread he'd baked 2 days ago, and listened to the radio. The reports were getting grim. Multiple accidents on the highways before they'd been closed. Several small towns completely cut off. Power outages affecting tens of thousands of people. Shelters opening in the larger towns, but many people unable to reach them due to impassable roads. And then, through the static and the howling wind, a different sound. An engine. Struggling, getting closer. Marcus went to the window and peered out. Through the white chaos, he could barely make out headlights, wavering, moving slowly up his access road. Someone was trying to reach his cabin. His first instinct was irritation. He'd put up signs. Private property, no trespassing, road not maintained in winter. Anyone with sense would turn back. But the vehicle kept coming, engine roaring as it fought through the deepening snow. Marcus pulled on his boots and heavy parka, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit him like a physical blow, wind stealing his breath. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, wind chill making it feel like 25 below. Exposed skin would get frostbite in less than 10 minutes in these conditions. The vehicle finally emerged from the white, a Subaru Outback, clearly not designed for these conditions, fishtailing badly. It made it another 20 feet before getting hopelessly stuck, wheels spinning uselessly. The driver's door opened and a man stumbled out, immediately falling face first into the snow. He got up, staggered forward, fell again. Marcus recognized the gait, the build. Tom Brennan, the gas station owner. Late 50s, overweight, definitely not dressed for this weather. Marcus swore under his breath and trudged out into the storm. The snow was well past his knees now, the wind trying to push him sideways. He reached Tom, who was struggling to stand, his face already showing signs of frostbite, lips blue, eyes wild with panic. "My daughter!" Tom gasped, clutching Marcus's arm. "Emma, she's sick, fever, can't breathe right. Ashley doesn't know what to do. No power, no heat, getting worse." Marcus knew Emma, had seen her around town. 9 years old, always reading a book. Ashley was Tom's wife, a teacher at the elementary school. "How long has she been sick?" Marcus asked, already pulling Tom toward the cabin. "Since yesterday. Thought it was just a cold, but it's getting worse, and now with the power out and everything." Tom's words dissolved into coughing. They made it to the porch, and Marcus practically shoved Tom inside. The warmth of the cabin hit them both. Tom collapsed into the nearest chair, shaking violently. "Where are they?" Marcus asked, already moving, grabbing dry clothes from his storage, a heavy wool blanket. "Home. The house on Maple Street. Marcus, please. I know people have given you a hard time, but she's just a little girl. She needs help." Marcus stood still for a moment, his jaw tight. The old anger flared. These were the people who mocked him, who called him paranoid, who thought his preparations were a joke. And now here they were, unprepared, suffering, asking for help. But then he saw Tom's face, the desperation of a father watching his child suffer, and he recognized it. He'd worn that same expression in a hospital waiting room 15 years ago, though in his case, there'd been no help to ask for, no miracle to hope for, just finality. "I'll get my gear," Marcus said. 10 minutes later, he was suited up properly. Insulated snow pants, heavy parka, goggles, face mask, insulated gloves, boots rated for 40 below. He'd loaded his medical kit, emergency supplies, and a portable heater into a sled attached to his snowmobile. The snowmobile was a 2015 Polaris, heavily modified, with tracks designed for deep snow and a windshield that actually protected the driver. "Stay here," he told Tom, who was finally warming up, wrapped in blankets by the fire. "Drink this." He handed him a thermos of hot coffee. "Don't touch anything. Don't go anywhere. I'll bring them back." Tom nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Thank you. God, Marcus, thank you." Marcus didn't respond. He was already running calculations. 4 miles to town, conditions deteriorating, visibility near zero, temperature still dropping. Dangerous, but doable. He'd trained for worse. He fired up the snowmobile and headed into the storm. The ride down was a nightmare. The wind tried to push him off the road constantly. The snow was so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead, navigating by memory and the GPS unit mounted to his handlebars. Drifts forced him to detour repeatedly. What should have been a 15-minute ride took 45 minutes of grueling concentration. Pinewood Valley was dark and silent, buried under nearly 2 feet of snow with drifts reaching 5 feet in places. No lights, no movement, just wind and white. It looked like a ghost town. Marcus navigated by memory to Maple Street, found the Brennan house by the blue shutters he remembered. He pounded on the door. Ashley answered almost immediately, her face streaked with tears, a flashlight in her shaking hand. "Marcus, Tom went to... Is he..." "He's at my cabin. He's fine. Show me Emma." The inside of the house was already cold, maybe 50 degrees and dropping. Ashley led him to a bedroom where a small figure lay buried under every blanket in the house. Emma's face was flushed with fever, her breathing rapid and shallow, a wet rattling sound coming from her chest. Marcus pulled out his medical kit and went to work with practiced efficiency. Temperature, 103.4. Pulse, 120, too fast. Respiration, 32 breaths per minute, labored. He listened to her lungs with his stethoscope, crackling sounds, fluid buildup, pneumonia, probably bacterial. "How long has she had the fever?" he asked, pulling out his emergency medication supply. "Since last night. It got worse this morning. I gave her children's Tylenol, but it's not helping." Marcus found what he needed. Amoxicillin, broad-spectrum antibiotic. He'd stocked it for emergencies, though he'd never imagined using it on someone else. He calculated the dosage based on Emma's weight and mixed it with water. "We need to get her fever down and get these antibiotics in her," he said. "But we can't do it here. It's too cold, and it's only getting colder. I need to take her to my cabin." Ashley's eyes went wide. "In this storm? Marcus, we can't—" "You can't stay here. This house will be uninhabitable in a few hours. No heat, temperature dropping. You'll both freeze." "But the storm is exactly why we need to go now before it gets worse. I have a heated cabin, medical supplies, food, everything she needs. Here she'll die." The bluntness of his words hit Ashley like a slap, but they had the desired effect. She nodded, already moving. "What do I need to bring?" "Warm clothes, anything essential you can't replace, 5 minutes." While Ashley packed with shaking hands, Marcus bundled Emma in every warm layer he could find, wrapping her like a mummy. She was semi-conscious, mumbling, her eyes glazed. He gave her the first dose of antibiotic and some ibuprofen to start bringing down the fever. The trip back was even worse. Marcus drove with one arm around Emma, holding her against his chest to share body heat, while Ashley clung to him from behind. The sled dragged behind them, loaded with their hastily packed bags. The visibility was zero now, true whiteout conditions. Marcus navigated purely by GPS and instinct, trusting his modified snowmobile to get them through. They were halfway up the mountain when Marcus saw another light in the distance. He slowed, squinting through the snow. Another house, barely visible, with someone standing on the porch waving frantically. He recognized the location, the Morrison place, elderly couple, Henry and Ruth, both in their 80s. He wanted to keep going. Emma needed to get warm, needed continuous care, but he could see Ruth's face now, desperate, terrified. Henry was visible through the window, slumped in a chair. Marcus swore into the wind and turned the snowmobile. Ruth was crying when he reached the porch. "He won't wake up properly. He's so cold. We ran out of firewood yesterday, and I don't know how to use the generator, and the pills for his heart are in the bedroom, but I can't carry him there and—" "How long has he been like this?" Marcus asked, already moving inside. The house was frigid, maybe 40 degrees. Henry was conscious but confused, showing signs of hypothermia. Shivering had stopped, speech slurred, not making sense. "Since this morning. Please, we didn't know the storm would be this bad. We thought—" Marcus made a decision. "Pack what you need. You're both coming with me." "But Henry can't—" "I'll carry him. 2 minutes, Ruth. Move." What happens next will turn this frozen nightmare into something nobody in Pinewood Valley expected, reveal the truth about the man they mocked, and remind us that sometimes survival depends on the people we've judged too quickly. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The trip back to the cabin with 4 people was a crawl through hell. Marcus had Henry wrapped in an emergency blanket, secured to the sled with Ruth beside him. Ashley still rode behind Marcus, holding Emma between them. The snowmobile struggled with the weight, tracks fighting for purchase in the deep snow. By the time Marcus's cabin appeared through the white chaos, he was exhausted, his arms burning from the effort of controlling the snowmobile, his face numb despite the protection. But the sight of his cabin, solid and warm and exactly where it should be, gave him a surge of energy. Tom met them at the door, his eyes going wide when he saw not just his wife and daughter, but the Morrisons as well. He helped Marcus get everyone inside, and suddenly the cabin that had seemed spacious felt crowded. Marcus went into full emergency mode. He got Emma into his bed in the loft, stripped off her wet outer layers, piled dry blankets on her, and started a humidifier near her to help her breathing. He checked her vitals again. Fever still high but stable, breathing still labored but no worse. The antibiotics would need time to work. Henry needed immediate attention. His core temperature was down to 94 degrees, dangerous but not critical yet. Marcus wrapped him in dry clothes and blankets, put him near the fire, and made him drink warm, not hot water. Too much heat too fast could cause cardiac arrest in someone with hypothermia. Ashley and Ruth were both on the edge of shock, shaking from cold and fear and relief. Marcus made them hot tea, gave them dry clothes, set them up near the fire. Only then did he allow himself to stop moving. He stood in the center of his cabin, looking at the 5 people who'd invaded his solitude, and felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. The weight of being responsible for someone other than himself. Tom approached him cautiously. "Marcus, I don't know how to thank you. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet," Marcus replied. "We're not out of this. That storm is going to get worse before it gets better. We're going to be here for days, maybe a week. This cabin is built for 1 person, not 6. We'll need to ration supplies, manage heat carefully, and work together." "Whatever you need," Tom said. "We'll do whatever you say." Marcus nodded. "First thing, everyone stays warm and dry. Second, we check on Emma every hour. If that fever doesn't start coming down in the next 6 hours, we've got a problem. Third, nobody goes outside without telling me. This storm will kill you in minutes if you're not careful." Over the next hours, a rhythm developed. Marcus managed everything with quiet efficiency, monitoring Emma's condition, checking Henry's temperature, maintaining the fire, managing the cabin's systems, rationing food and water. Ashley helped where she could, grateful for something to do. Tom and Ruth stayed near the fire, too exhausted and overwhelmed to do much else. By evening, the storm had reached its peak fury. The wind was a constant roar, shaking even Marcus's reinforced structure. Snow was falling at rates he'd never seen, 4 to 5 inches per hour. Drifts were reaching 10 feet in places. The temperature had bottomed out at 12 below zero, with wind chill approaching 50 below. And through it all, the radio brought worse news. The entire region was paralyzed. Highways closed, towns cut off, power out for over 50,000 people. Emergency services were overwhelmed, unable to respond to most calls. Several people had already died, heart attacks from shoveling snow, carbon monoxide poisoning from running generators in garages, exposure from being caught outside. And in Pinewood Valley, things were getting desperate. The knock came at 7:43 p.m., barely audible over the storm. Marcus heard it only because he'd been near the door, checking the seal around the frame. He opened it to find a snow-covered figure collapsed on his porch. He dragged the person inside. It was David Park, who owned the hardware store, lips blue, ice crystals in his eyebrows, barely conscious. "More people," David gasped as Marcus stripped off his frozen outer layers. "In town, no heat, freezing. Heard about Tom and the Morrisons, sent me to find you." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "How many?" 20, maybe more. The bar is the only place people could gather, but there's no heat there either. They're burning furniture to stay warm, but it's not enough. There are kids, Marcus. Babies." The cabin fell silent, except for the roar of the wind. Everyone was looking at Marcus now. He closed his eyes, his jaw tight. This was exactly what he'd tried to avoid. This was why he'd built a fortress for one, why he'd isolated himself, why he'd kept the world at arm's length. Because once you let people in, once you took responsibility for them, there was no end to it. "Marcus," Ashley said softly, "we have to help them." "I can't fit 20 more people in here," he said, his voice harder than he intended. "This cabin is already over capacity. The systems are designed for one person, maybe two in an emergency. We're already pushing it with 6. "So what are they supposed to do?" Tom asked. "Just freeze?" Marcus didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know. He couldn't save everyone. He'd built this place to save himself, not to be a shelter for the entire town. The town that had mocked him, rejected him, called him crazy. But then he looked at Emma, sleeping fitfully in his bed, her fever finally starting to break thanks to his medicine. He looked at Henry, warming up by his fire, color returning to his face. He looked at Ashley and Ruth and Tom and David, all of them alive because he'd been prepared, because he'd built something that could withstand the storm. And he thought about Sarah and Daniel, about how he'd give anything for someone to have saved them, about how he'd spent 15 years hiding from the world because he couldn't save them. Maybe he couldn't save everyone. But could he really let people freeze when he had the knowledge and resources to help? "Tell me exactly what's happening in town," he said to David. Over the next hour, David painted a grim picture. The power had gone out early, and most homes had lost heat within hours. Some people had fireplaces or wood stoves, but many had run out of wood or didn't know how to use them properly. The bar, the Antler, had become an unofficial shelter because it had a large wood stove, but there were too many people and not enough fuel. They were burning chairs and tables now, and that wouldn't last long. Several homes had elderly or sick people who couldn't make it to the bar. The town's small fire station had a generator, but it had run out of fuel. Brett and Amber Holloway were in their modern house with the floor-to-ceiling windows, and it was losing heat rapidly despite their expensive heating system. The massive windows that made the house so beautiful were bleeding warmth like open wounds. "What about medical issues?" Marcus asked. "Mrs. Chen at the post office has diabetes, needs her insulin kept cold but not frozen. The Miller baby is only 3 months old. Old man Walsh has COPD, needs his oxygen machine. There's more, but I don't know all of it." Marcus stood and looked out his window at the storm. The wind was still howling, the snow still falling. This wasn't going to stop anytime soon. The forecast said at least 3 more days of heavy snow, maybe 4. And even after the storm stopped, it would take days for roads to be cleared, for power to be restored, for help to arrive. If he did nothing, people would die. That was the simple truth. But if he tried to help, he'd be risking everything he'd built, all his carefully managed supplies, his security, his isolation. And for what? For people who'd spent years mocking him. He looked at Emma again, her small face peaceful now that the fever was dropping. "Damn it," he muttered. He turned to the others. "All right, here's what we're going to do. We can't bring everyone here, but we can teach them how to survive where they are. And we can bring the most vulnerable people here. But I need everyone's help, and I need everyone to follow my instructions exactly. No arguments, no debates. Lives depend on it. Tom stood up. Tell us what to do. Marcus pulled out a notebook and started making lists, his engineer's mind working through the problems methodically. He had supplies, knowledge, and equipment. What he needed was a way to distribute them efficiently without getting anyone killed in the process. Tom, I need you to inventory everything in this cabin. Food, water, fuel, medical supplies, everything. Be exact. Ashley, you're going to help me make a list of everyone in town and what their specific needs are. David, you know the hardware store. What supplies are there that could help? Over the next 2 hours, they planned. Marcus would take his snowmobile down to town multiple times, delivering supplies and instructions. He'd bring back the most vulnerable, the very young, the very old, the sick. His cabin would become a triage center. Everyone else would have to shelter in place, but he'd give them the knowledge to do it safely. He'd teach them how to properly run a wood stove without burning down their house or getting carbon monoxide poisoning. He'd distribute his spare propane heaters and fuel. He'd make sure people understood how to insulate a single room and heat just that space instead of trying to heat an entire house. He'd bring medical supplies to those who needed them. It would use up most of his reserves. It would put his own safety at risk. It would expose him to the very thing he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Depending on others, being part of a community, caring what happened to people beyond himself. But as he looked at the faces in his cabin, as he thought about the children and elderly people freezing in the dark below, he realized something. He'd built this fortress to survive, but survival without purpose was just existence. He'd been existing for 15 years, going through the motions, alive but not living. Maybe it was time to change that. All right, he said, pulling on his gear again. Let's get to work. The first run down to Pinewood Valley at 9 p.m. was a test of everything Marcus had built his life around. The storm had reached a sustained fury that seemed almost personal, wind shrieking at 70 miles per hour. Snow falling so thick it was like trying to navigate through a moving wall. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and with wind chill, it felt like 55 below. Exposed skin would freeze in less than 5 minutes. Marcus loaded the snowmobile's sled with supplies he'd carefully selected. 3 portable propane heaters with fuel canisters, emergency blankets, hand warmers, flashlights with extra batteries, water purification tablets, basic medical supplies, and detailed instruction sheets he'd written out explaining how to safely heat a single room, how to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning, how to melt snow for water, how to recognize hypothermia and frostbite. Before he left, he gathered everyone in the cabin. While I'm gone, Tom, you're in charge of the fire. Don't let it get too hot or too cold. Ashley, check on Emma every 15 minutes. If her fever spikes above 104 or if her breathing gets worse, there's a bag of medications in the cabinet above the sink with instructions. Henry, Ruth, stay warm and don't move around too much. David, there's food in the pantry. Help yourself to whatever you need for everyone. I'll be back in 2 hours. 2 hours in this? Ashley asked, fear in her voice. I know the route, I'll be fine. Marcus pulled his goggles down. Just keep everyone safe here. The ride down was worse than the first trip. The drifts had grown even larger, some reaching 12 feet where the wind had piled snow against natural barriers. Marcus had to detour constantly, trusting his GPS and his memory of the terrain. Twice his snowmobile got stuck, and he had to dig it out with the folding shovel he kept strapped to the sled, working in conditions that would have killed an unprepared person in minutes. When he finally reached the antler, he found chaos barely held at bay. The bar's windows glowed from the fire burning inside, but it was a desperate kind of light. He pushed through the door into a scene he'd never forget. 27 people packed into a space meant for maybe 15 comfortably. Children crying, parents trying to comfort them with shaking voices. The wood stove was blazing, surrounded by people, but the heat barely reached the edges of the room. Someone had hung blankets over the windows and door to try to contain warmth. The furniture near the stove had been broken up for fuel, chairs and tables reduced to kindling. Sally Miller saw him first, her eyes going wide. "Marcus?" Everyone turned. The conversation stopped. Marcus saw faces he recognized from his trips to town. the mayor, Jack Morrison, who ran the post office, Lisa Chen, who had always been quietly kind to him, young parents clutching their children, elderly folks huddled together, and Brett Holloway standing near the stove with Amber, his face going through a complex series of expressions: surprise, shame, defiance, desperate hope. "I brought supplies," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence. "But more importantly, I brought information on how to keep yourselves alive until this storm passes." He spent the next 30 minutes giving them a crash course in winter survival. He demonstrated how to properly set up the propane heaters, explaining the crucial importance of ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup. He showed them how to create a heat tent using blankets or tarps to contain warmth in a smaller space. He explained how to melt snow for water, but warned them about the energy cost of melting it versus finding liquid water. He taught them the signs of hypothermia and frostbite and what to do about them. The room was silent except for his voice and the howl of the wind outside. People took notes on scraps of paper. Parents held children close, absorbing every word. "The most important thing," Marcus said, "is to heat one room, not the whole building. Pick your smallest room with a door that closes. Everyone stays in that room. Use blankets to insulate the walls if you can. Seal gaps around the door. You can keep a space this size survivable with just body heat if you do it right." "How long?" someone asked. "How long do we have to do this?" Marcus checked his weather radio. "Storm's supposed to last another 72 to 96 hours. After that, it'll take time for roads to clear, for power to come back. Figure a week total, minimum." The number hit them hard. He could see the fear, the realization of just how serious this was. "What about people who can't make it here?" Lisa asked. "Elderly folks? Sick people?" "I'm going to them next. I'll bring the most vulnerable back to my cabin, but I need information. Who needs help most urgently?" The next hour was spent creating a triage list. Mrs. Chen at the post office apartment, diabetic, needed insulin storage. The Millers had a 3-month-old baby who needed to stay warm. Henry Walsh, not the Henry currently at Marcus's cabin, but his brother George, had COPD and needed his oxygen concentrator, which required power. The Gonzalez family had twin 2-year-olds and a house with poor insulation. Old Mrs. Patterson was 91 and lived alone. Marcus committed it all to memory, then divided up the supplies he'd brought. The propane heaters went to families with small children. Medical supplies to those with specific needs. Hand warmers and emergency blankets distributed to everyone. Before he left, Brett approached him. Up close, Marcus could see that the younger man's expensive outdoor gear was completely inadequate for these conditions. He was shivering despite being near the stove. "Marcus, Brett started, then stopped. His jaw worked. "Our house, it's all windows. We thought it would be fine, but it's so cold. Amber is pregnant. We just found out last week. She's only 8 weeks along, but I'm worried about her, about the cold." Marcus looked at Brett. This man who'd called him paranoid and antisocial just 2 days ago. He saw fear, genuine fear, and beneath it, the same thing he'd seen in Tom's face. A desperate father trying to protect his family. "Where's Amber now?" "At the house. I came here to see if anyone knew what to do. The heat's gone completely. We tried the fireplace, but it's gas and won't work without electricity." Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, "Go get her. Bring her back here where there's heat. Then you and I are going to your house, and I'm going to teach you how to winterize it properly. You have supplies there?" Brett nodded. "Food, water, some camping gear." "Good. We'll make it work. But Brett..." Marcus locked eyes with him. "When this is over, when the storm passes, I want you to remember something. I didn't do this to prove a point or to make you feel bad. I did it because it needed doing. And in the future, maybe think twice before you mock someone's choices when you don't understand the reasons behind them." Brett's face flushed, but he nodded. "I will, I promise. And Marcus, thank you. I'm sorry for what I said." Marcus just nodded and turned to go. He had work to do. The next 6 hours were a blur of snowmobile runs, each one a battle against the storm. Marcus's body was pushed to its limits, but his mind stayed sharp, focused by years of discipline and preparation. He went to Mrs. Chen's apartment above the post office and found her rationing her insulin, trying to make it last. He packed her and her medications carefully and brought her back to his cabin, where the temperature-controlled environment would keep her insulin stable. He stopped at the Miller house, where Sally and her husband Frank were wrapped around their 3-month-old son, trying to keep him warm with their body heat. The baby, James, was lethargic from the cold. Marcus taught them how to create a nest of blankets, how to use hot water bottles safely, and left them with a propane heater and explicit instructions. But he could see the baby wasn't doing well. "He needs to come with me," Marcus said. "The cold is dangerous for someone that young. He needs stable heat." Sally's eyes filled with tears. "I can't let him go. He's my baby." "Then you both come. Frank can manage here with the heater and the instructions. But James needs better conditions than this." 15 minutes later, Sally and baby James were on their way up the mountain, Sally holding her son tight while riding behind Marcus on the snowmobile. The Gonzalez twins, Maria and Miguel, 2-year-olds with bright eyes and runny noses, came next. Their parents, Rosa and Juan, were trying desperately to keep them warm in a house that was barely 40 degrees and dropping. Marcus made the call. The children were too young, too vulnerable. They needed to come to the cabin. Rosa was crying as she packed bags. "We should all come. We should all stay together." Marcus shook his head. "I don't have room, but your kids will be safe, I promise you. And I'll teach you everything you need to know to stay safe here until we can reunite you." It was one of the hardest conversations he'd ever had, watching parents make the choice to send their babies away for their safety. But Rosa and Juan were smart enough to know that their children's survival was more important than their comfort. By 3 a.m., Marcus's cabin was packed with 11 people: Tom, Ashley, Emma, Henry, Ruth, David, Mrs. Chen, Sally, baby James, and the Gonzalez twins. The cabin that had been built for solitude now rang with the sounds of life: children fussing, adults murmuring, the crackle of the fire, the hiss of the propane stove Marcus was using to cook. His supplies were being depleted faster than he'd planned. His solitude was completely shattered. His carefully ordered life had become chaos. And yet, as he moved through the crowded space, checking on Emma's fever, down to 99.8, the antibiotics working, adjusting Henry's blankets, helping Sally get baby James to nurse, he felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years, purpose beyond mere survival. Ashley found him in the kitchen area at 4 a.m., making another pot of coffee. "You should rest," she said quietly. "You've been going for nearly 24 hours straight." "I'm fine." "No, you're not. You're exhausted. Let someone else help." Marcus turned to her, and for a moment, the wall he'd built around himself cracked just slightly. "I don't know how to let people help." Ashley smiled sadly. "I know. Tom told me about your wife and son. I'm so sorry, Marcus, but you've saved so many people tonight. You've saved my daughter. You've got to let us give something back." "There's more to do. George Walsh still needs help with his oxygen situation. Mrs. Patterson is alone. The people at the Antler need more supplies. And you'll do all of it. But you need to sleep for a few hours first, or you're going to make a mistake. And in these conditions, a mistake can be fatal. You know that." She was right, and Marcus knew it. Exhaustion was clouding his judgment, slowing his reactions. In the mountains, in a storm like this, that could kill him. 4 hours, he said finally. "Wake me in 4 hours." 6, 4, or I'm not sleeping at all. Ashley sighed. "Fine, 4 hours." Marcus climbed to his loft, stepping carefully over sleeping bodies, and collapsed onto the floor beside his bed, where Emma was sleeping peacefully. He was asleep before he could think about how strange it was to be surrounded by people again. He dreamed of Sarah and Daniel for the first time in years. But this time, the dream wasn't a nightmare of loss. They were in the cabin, Sarah making coffee, Daniel playing with the Gonzalez twins, both of them smiling at him with expressions that seemed to say, "This is right. This is what we would have wanted." He woke exactly 3 hours and 57 minutes later, his internal clock still precise despite the exhaustion. The cabin was quieter now, most people sleeping, the only sounds the fire and the storm outside. Tom was awake, keeping watch over the fire as instructed. "Everyone okay?" Marcus asked quietly. Tom nodded. "Emma's fever is completely gone. She woke up an hour ago asking for food, which Ashley said was a good sign. Mrs. Chen's blood sugar is stable. The babies are sleeping. Henry's doing better. We're managing."
"Good. I need to get back out there. There are still people who need help."
"Marcus," Tom's voice stopped him. "Why are you doing this? Really? These people haven't exactly been kind to you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My wife and son died because I wasn't there. I was at work, chasing things that didn't matter, and they needed me, and I wasn't there." His voice was rough, the words painful even after 15 years. "I built this cabin so I'd never be helpless again. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that being prepared doesn't just mean surviving. It means being able to help when others can't help themselves." He turned to Tom. "I can't bring my family back, but maybe I can make sure other people don't lose theirs." Tom's eyes were wet. "They're lucky to have you. We all are." Marcus just nodded and started gearing up again. The second day of the storm was somehow worse than the first. The snow had accumulated to over 3 feet in most places, with drifts reaching 15 to 20 feet. The wind was still howling at 60 to 70 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped even further, 18 below zero without wind chill. The world had become a white hell, and Marcus was determined to navigate it. His first stop was George Walsh's house. George was 79, a Korean War veteran with severe COPD who needed his oxygen concentrator to breathe. Without power, the machine was useless, and George was struggling. Marcus found him sitting in a chair, lips blue, breathing in short, desperate gasps. His daughter Linda, who lived with him, was panicking. "He's dying," she sobbed when Marcus came through the door. "I don't know what to do. His spare oxygen tanks ran out this morning." Marcus assessed the situation quickly. George needed oxygen, and the concentrator needed power. Marcus had brought a portable generator, small but powerful enough to run essential medical equipment. He set it up outside. Generators produce carbon monoxide and must never be run indoors, ran a heavy-duty extension cord through a window, and got the concentrator running within 20 minutes. George's color improved almost immediately as the oxygen flowed. But Marcus could see the bigger problem. George couldn't stay here. The house was too cold, too difficult to heat, and he needed constant medical monitoring. "He needs to come to my cabin," Marcus told Linda. "He can't travel in this. The cold, the exertion. The cold here will kill him. I have a heated sled. I'll make it as comfortable as possible. But Linda, he needs stable heat and someone who can monitor his breathing. I can provide that." Linda looked at her father, at his blue-tinged lips and labored breathing, and made the decision. "Okay, tell me what to do." Getting George to the cabin was a delicate operation. Marcus bundled him in multiple layers, used chemical heat packs to keep him warm, and strapped him securely into the sled, which he'd lined with foam padding. Linda came too, unable to bear being separated from her father. By the time Marcus got them back to the cabin, it was past noon on day 2, and he was running on fumes. But there was no time to rest. More people needed help. The cabin was beyond capacity now, 13 people in a space designed for one. Marcus had to institute strict protocols: heat management, water rationing, food distribution, waste management in a composting toilet designed for one person, but now serving 13. His carefully planned supplies were being depleted at an alarming rate, but everyone was alive. Everyone was warm, and slowly a community was forming. The adults organized themselves without being asked. Tom and David managed the fire, keeping it at the exact temperature Marcus specified. Ashley and Rosa, who'd insisted on coming up with her twins despite Marcus's protests, handled meal preparation and childcare. Sally and Linda took care of the medical needs, following Marcus's instructions precisely. Mrs. Chen, despite her own health issues, organized the sleeping arrangements, somehow making the cramped space functional. And Marcus became their anchor, the one they all looked to when problems arose, the one who made the hard decisions, the one who ventured out into the storm again and again to bring supplies and help those who couldn't come to the cabin. On one of his runs to town, he stopped at Brett and Amber's modern glass house. He'd taught Brett how to winterize a single room, and Brett had done it well, using camping tarps to cover the massive windows, creating a heat tent in their bedroom, managing their resources carefully. But Amber was struggling. The stress, the cold, the fear, it was taking a toll. She was cramping, spotting, terrified she was losing the baby. Marcus examined her as best he could with his limited medical training. "I think she's okay, but she needs rest, warmth, and low stress, none of which she's getting here." Brett's face was anguished. "Bring her to your cabin, please. I'll stay here. I'll manage. Just keep her safe." And so Amber joined the growing household, 14 people now, sharing resources, sharing space, sharing the burden of survival. That night, as Marcus sat by the fire after everyone else had gone to sleep, he realized something profound. This was the most people he'd been responsible for since he'd been a department head at his engineering firm 15 years ago. But this was different. Those had been employees, colleagues, relationships bound by contracts and paychecks. These were neighbors, fellow humans, bound by something much more basic, the simple need to survive together. The third day brought a new crisis. The storm showed no signs of stopping. The forecast now called for 5 to 6 days of heavy snow instead of 3 to 4. Marcus's supplies were being depleted faster than he'd calculated. His propane, carefully stockpiled over years, was running lower than he was comfortable with. His food stores, planned for one person for months, were now feeding 14 people. He sat down with a notebook and ran the numbers. At current consumption rates, he had maybe 8 to 10 days before critical shortages. The storm was supposed to last 5 to 6 days. Then roads would take 2 to 3 days to clear. 9 days total, maybe 10. It would be tight, dangerously tight, but manageable if everyone was careful. He called a house meeting, gathering everyone who was conscious and able to participate. "We need to talk about resources," he said bluntly. "I built this place for one person. We're 14 now. My supplies are finite and we're using them faster than I planned." The room fell silent. Fear flickered across faces. "We're not in danger," Marcus continued quickly. "But we need to be smart. Starting now, we ration everything. Water, food, heat, light. I've made a schedule." He held up the notebook. "Everyone gets enough to stay healthy and warm, but we can't waste anything." "What can we do to help?" Tom asked. "Conserve. Take shorter showers." He used finger quotes since showers meant sponge baths with heated water. "Eat every bite of food you're given. Wear extra layers instead of turning up the heat. Don't leave the door open longer than necessary. Small things, but they add up." Over the next days, Marcus watched his carefully isolated world transform into something he never could have imagined. The people crammed into his cabin began to function as a unit, helping each other without being asked, sharing without complaint. Emma, recovered from her pneumonia, read stories to the Gonzalez twins. George, breathing easier with his oxygen, taught the children card games from his Navy days. Sally and Ashley took turns cooking, improvising meals from limited ingredients that somehow tasted better than anything Marcus had eaten in years. Tom and David organized work details, keeping the cabin clean and functional. And slowly, Marcus began to let go of some of his rigid control. He let Tom manage the fire without hovering. He let Ashley make medical decisions about Emma. He let Sally reorganize his medical supplies in a way that made more sense for multiple people. He let David modify the sleeping arrangements to be more efficient. He was learning to trust again, something he'd thought impossible. On day 4, Marcus made what would be his last supply run to town. The storm was still raging, but it had settled into a consistent pattern. Heavy snow, high winds, brutal cold, but navigable for someone with his skills and equipment. He loaded the snowmobile with the last of his spare propane heaters, the last of his extra blankets, and headed down. The Antler had become a true community shelter now, with people taking shifts managing the heat and supplies Marcus had provided. They'd organized themselves, rationing food, sharing body heat, surviving. When Marcus arrived, he was greeted not with shame or resentment, but with genuine gratitude. The mayor, Jack Morrison, pulled him aside. "You saved this town, Marcus. We'd have lost people without you. Hell, we'd have lost a lot of people." Marcus shook his head. "You saved yourselves. I just gave you the tools and the knowledge. You did the work." "Maybe. But you didn't have to help. Not after how we've treated you." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "Yeah, I did. Because that's what people do. They help each other. I just forgot that for a while." He distributed the last of his supplies, checked on everyone one more time, and headed back to his cabin through the screaming wind and endless snow, feeling lighter despite his exhaustion. When he walked through his cabin door at nearly midnight on day 4, he was greeted by a sight that stopped him in his tracks. Someone, probably Ashley and Sally, had strung up a makeshift banner made from a sheet and markers. "Thank you, Marcus." 14 people were crowded into his living space, and every single one of them was smiling at him. The children clapped, the adults nodded with respect and warmth. Marcus stood there, snow melting off his gear, exhaustion making his legs shake, and felt something break open inside him. It wasn't pain this time. It was something else, something he'd thought he'd lost forever. It was belonging. Emma came up to him and hugged his leg. "You're like a superhero, Mr. Marcus. You save people." He looked down at her. This child who'd been dying of pneumonia just days ago, now healthy and bright-eyed, and had to blink back tears. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough. "I'm just a man who built a cabin. The real heroes are all of you, staying strong, helping each other, surviving together." That night, after everyone had settled down to sleep, Marcus stood on his porch despite the cold and the wind. The storm was still raging, but the forecast said it would break tomorrow. One more day, maybe 2, and it would be over. He looked down at Pinewood Valley, invisible under the blanket of snow and darkness, and thought about all the people down there who'd survived because they'd worked together. He thought about the people in his cabin sleeping peacefully because they'd trusted him and each other. And he thought about Sarah and Daniel, about how they'd have loved this, loved the chaos and the community and the purpose of it all. "I think I'm finally ready to live again," he whispered to the storm, to the memory of his family, to himself. The wind howled in response, but it sounded less like fury now and more like agreement. The storm broke on the afternoon of day 6, not with a whimper, but with a sudden, almost eerie silence. Marcus was outside, clearing snow from around the cabin's ventilation system, when he noticed it first. The wind, which had been a constant roar for nearly a week, simply stopped. The snow, which had been falling in thick curtains, tapered to scattered flakes, then nothing. He stood still, listening to the quiet. It was profound, almost overwhelming after days of constant noise. Around him, the world was transformed into something from a fairy tale. Snow had reshaped everything, smoothing harsh edges, creating sculptures from trees and rocks. The sky, visible for the first time in days, was a pale, clear blue that seemed to go on forever. The door opened behind him, and Tom stepped out, followed by David and Ashley. They all stood there together, just breathing in the silence and the stillness. "It's over," Ashley said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might bring the storm back. "The storm is," Marcus replied, "but we've still got work ahead of us." He was right. The snow depth was staggering, over 5 feet in most places, with drifts that reached 15 to 20 feet. His cabin was nearly buried, the first-floor windows completely covered. The path he'd cleared just hours ago was already filling back in with wind-driven snow. But the immediate danger had passed. Now came the recovery. Over the next hours, Marcus monitored the radio constantly. Emergency services were mobilizing. The National Guard was deploying with heavy equipment to clear main roads. Power crews were working around the clock to restore electricity. But it would take time, days, maybe a week before things returned to normal. For the people in Marcus's cabin, The waiting was the hardest part. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, people were anxious to get home, to check on their properties, to reunite with loved ones. Rosa wanted her husband. Tom and Ashley wanted to go home as a family. Brett wanted to see Amber, but Marcus was firm. Nobody leaves until conditions are safe, and we know where you're going has heat and supplies. Moving too soon is how people die after a storm like this. On day 7, the sun came out fully, blindingly bright against the endless white. Marcus used his snowblower and plow to clear a path from his cabin to the main road, a task that took most of the morning and left him exhausted, despite the machine doing most of the work. The snow was so deep in places that he had to make multiple passes, creating walls of white on either side that towered over his head. That afternoon, he made his first trip down to Pinewood Valley since the storm ended. The town was unrecognizable. Snow had buried cars completely. Buildings were half submerged. The streets were impassable except by snowmobile or on foot with snowshoes. But there was activity now, people digging out, checking on neighbors, assessing damage. The Antler had survived well, the people inside having followed Marcus's instructions to the letter. They'd lost some furniture to the stove, but everyone had made it through. When Marcus arrived, he was greeted like a returning hero. People rushed out to shake his hand, to thank him, to tell him stories of how his advice had saved them. The mayor pulled him aside, his face serious. "Marcus, I want to call a town meeting. Once people can move around safely. There are things we need to discuss, lessons we need to learn, and we need to properly thank you." "I don't need thanks," Marcus said. "I know you don't, but we need to give it anyway." Marcus checked on the families he'd helped, the Millers, the Gonzaleses, the various elderly folks living alone. Everyone had survived, though some had close calls. Houses were damaged, burst pipes from freezing, roof damage from snow load, broken windows from wind-driven debris. But no one had died, and in a storm that severe, that was a miracle. Brett and Amber's glass house had suffered significant damage. Several of the large windows had cracked from the stress of the temperature differential and snow load. Their beautiful modern home would need major repairs. But they'd survived, and that was what mattered. When Marcus got back to his cabin that evening, he found that Tom and David had organized the others into preparing a feast. Well, as much of a feast as their limited supplies allowed. They'd combined their remaining food into one large meal: venison stew, fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and even a cobbler made from canned fruit. "What's this?" Marcus asked as he walked in to find the table set, everyone dressed in their cleanest clothes. "A celebration," Sally said, smiling. "We survived. That's worth celebrating." They gathered around the table, 14 people squeezed into a space meant for one, and for a moment before they ate, everyone was silent. Then George, the elderly Korean war vet, cleared his throat. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice strengthened by the oxygen he no longer needed constantly. "I've been through a lot in my life. War, loss, hard times, but I've never seen anything like what happened here. Not the storm. Storms come and go. What I saw was a community come together when it mattered most, and at the center of it all was a man who had every reason to turn his back on us, but didn't." He looked at Marcus. "You saved my life. You saved a lot of lives. But more than that, you showed us what it means to be prepared, not just with supplies, but with character. You're a good man, Marcus Chen. Don't you ever forget that." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He looked around the table at faces that had become familiar over the past week. Emma, healthy and bright-eyed, baby James, content in his mother's arms, the Gonzalez twins playing with spoons and making each other giggle, Mrs. Chen, her diabetes managed, Henry and Ruth, holding hands like newlyweds, Amber, her pregnancy safe, Ashley and Tom and Sally and David and Linda and George, all of them alive because they'd worked together. "I'm not the hero here," he said finally. "Every single person in this room made choices to survive, to help each other, to push through when things got hard. That's what saved us. Not me, us." Ashley raised her water glass. "To us then, and to Marcus, who made us possible." Everyone raised their glasses, and Marcus, feeling more emotion than he'd allowed himself in 15 years, raised his too. Over the next several days, life slowly began to return to normal, though nothing would ever be quite the same. Power was restored to Pinewood Valley on day 9, flickering on with a cheer that could be heard even up at Marcus's cabin. Roads were cleared by day 11, heavy equipment from the county pushing through the massive snowbanks to reconnect the isolated town. People began leaving the cabin in groups as conditions allowed and as their homes became livable again. Tom, Ashley, and Emma were the first to go, their house having suffered minimal damage and now having power and heat. Emma hugged Marcus fiercely before she left. "Will you come visit us?" she asked. Marcus hesitated, his instinct to say no, to retreat back into his solitude. But then he looked at her hopeful face and found himself saying, "Yes, I'd like that." The Millers left next, then Mrs. Chen, then the Morrisons. Each departure made the cabin feel a little emptier, a little more like it had been before. Marcus told himself he was glad to have his space back, his routine, his solitude. But he found himself missing the noise, the chaos, the sense of purpose that came from taking care of people. On day 14, after the storm began, the last of his guests departed. Rosa and Juan came to collect their twins, the reunion tearful and joyful. George and Linda left together, George's breathing much improved. Amber went home to Brett, who'd spent the time apart making his damaged house safe and warm. By evening, Marcus stood alone in his cabin for the first time in 2 weeks. He'd cleaned obsessively after everyone left, scrubbing away evidence of occupation, restoring order to his carefully organized space. Everything was back in its place. Everything was quiet. Everything was exactly as it had been. He should have been relieved. Instead, he felt hollow. He tried to fall back into his old routine, maintenance on his systems, inventory of depleted supplies, repairs to equipment that had been pushed beyond normal limits. But the work felt empty now, mechanical, devoid of meaning. That night, he sat alone by the fire, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. He thought about the past 2 weeks, about the fear and the effort and the exhaustion, but also about the moments of connection, the shared laughter, the sense of being part of something larger than himself. He thought about Sarah and Daniel, and for the first time, he let himself imagine what they would say about how he'd spent the last 15 years. Would they be proud of the fortress he'd built? Or would they be sad that he'd locked himself away from the world? He knew the answer. They'd want him to live, truly live, not just survive. The knock on his door the next morning surprised him. He opened it to find the mayor, Jack Morrison, along with Tom, Sally, and several other people from town. "Can we come in?" Jack asked. Marcus stepped aside, confused. "What's this about?" They filed in, looking around the cabin with new appreciation. Sally held a large basket covered with a cloth. Tom carried what looked like a framed photograph. Jack carried a folder full of papers. "We wanted to talk to you about something," Jack began. "The whole town, actually. We had a meeting last night and there was unanimous agreement on a proposal." Marcus waited, wary. "What happened during the storm?" Jack continued. "It exposed a lot of weaknesses in our town's emergency preparedness. We had no shelter plan, no emergency supplies, no coordination, no training. People could have died. People would have died if not for you. I just did what anyone would." "No," Jack interrupted firmly. "That's not true, and we all know it. You did what someone with knowledge, preparation, and most importantly, the willingness to help could do. And we want to make sure that if something like this happens again, we're ready." He opened the folder. "We're proposing the creation of a town emergency management position, paid position, not a lot, but enough. The person would be responsible for maintaining emergency supplies, training volunteers, creating response plans, coordinating with county and state emergency services. We want you for the job, Marcus." Marcus stared at him. "Me? You're the most qualified person in 100 miles. You proved that. I don't do well with people. I'm not a people person." Tom spoke up. "You saved 14 people in your cabin and helped dozens more in town. You coordinated a rescue operation in conditions that would have killed most people. You taught us how to survive. I'd say you do pretty well with people when it matters. Sally stepped forward with the basket. Also, this is from everyone in town. We all contributed. She pulled back the cloth to reveal supplies: coffee, fresh vegetables, bread, preserves, batteries, propane canisters, medical supplies. To restock what you used helping us. Marcus felt his chest tighten. You didn't have to. We know, Sally said gently. But we wanted to. You gave without expecting anything back. Let us give something back to you. Tom held up the framed photograph. And this is from all of us too. He turned it around. It was a photo someone had taken during the storm, shot through a window at the Antler. It showed Marcus on his snowmobile, barely visible through the blizzard, the sled behind him loaded with supplies. Below the photo, dozens of signatures, every person in town who'd survived the storm. Above the signatures, a simple inscription: to Marcus Chen, who taught us that being prepared means being ready to help. Thank you from Pinewood Valley. Marcus took the frame with shaking hands. He looked at all those signatures, all those names of people he'd kept at arm's length for years, all of them thanking him. I don't know what to say, he managed. Say you'll think about the job offer, Jack said. You don't have to decide now. But Marcus, we need you, not just for your skills, but because you give a damn. That matters more than you know. After they left, Marcus sat with the photograph in his lap for a long time. He thought about the isolation he'd chosen, the fortress he'd built, the years spent alone. He thought about his old therapist's words. You're hiding from life. Maybe he had been. But the storm had cracked that fortress open, had forced him to engage, to help, to care. And in doing so, it had reminded him of something he'd forgotten. That life wasn't just about surviving. It was about connection, purpose, meaning. It was about being part of something larger than yourself. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision. He walked down to his workshop and pulled out lumber he'd been saving for repairs. He spent the rest of the day building something he never thought he'd build, a bench for his porch, wide enough for 2 people, because maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to let people in. 3 days later, Marcus drove down to Town Hall to give Jack his answer. The road was clear now, though massive snowbanks on either side created a tunnel of white. The town was digging out, life returning to a new kind of normal. He found Jack in his office, surrounded by paperwork, damage assessments, insurance claims, state aid applications. I'll take the job, Marcus said without preamble, on one condition. Jack looked up, hope and relief flooding his face. Name it. I want to train people, not just give orders. I want to teach the whole town what I know about emergency preparedness, winter survival, all of it. I want everyone to be ready next time, not just dependent on one person. Jack stood and extended his hand. That's exactly what we need. Welcome aboard, Marcus. Over the following weeks, Marcus's life transformed in ways he never could have imagined. He spent mornings at Town Hall, working with Jack to develop emergency response plans, inventory community resources, and identify vulnerable populations who'd need special help in a crisis. He spent afternoons teaching classes at the community center: basic winter survival, emergency preparedness, first aid, home winterization. People showed up, not just a few, but dozens. Everyone who'd survived the storm wanted to learn, wanted to be ready, and Marcus discovered he was a natural teacher, his engineer's mind breaking down complex topics into understandable steps, his patience born from years of solitary projects serving him well with beginners. Brett Holloway was in every class, taking notes, asking questions, learning. The smugness was gone, replaced by genuine humility and eagerness to learn. He approached Marcus after a class on emergency heat sources. I wanted to apologize again, Brett said, for what I said before the storm. I was wrong about you, wrong about a lot of things. Marcus nodded slowly. You weren't entirely wrong. I was hiding up there, running from the world. The storm forced me to stop running. Still, I shouldn't have mocked you. You were prepared and I wasn't. I put Amber at risk because of my arrogance. Brett's voice cracked slightly. She's okay. The baby's okay. But it could have been so much worse. Learn from it, Marcus said. Teach your kid about it when they're old enough. Make sure the next generation does better than we did. Brett smiled. Speaking of which, Amber and I were talking. If it's a boy, we'd like to name him Marcus, if that's okay with you. Marcus felt emotion well up, unexpected and overwhelming. I'd be honored. The community center classes evolved into something more. People started staying after to talk, to share coffee, to help each other with projects. Marcus found himself at the center of a growing community, no longer the isolated hermit, but a respected teacher, advisor, and friend. Emma and her parents invited him to dinner one evening. Their house was modest but warm, filled with laughter and life. Emma showed him her room, her books, her drawings, one of which was labeled Mr. Marcus Saving People in the Snow. "You're coming to my birthday party, right?" Emma asked. "It's in 2 weeks. I'm turning 10. Marcus had been about to make an excuse, but he looked at her hopeful face and found himself saying, "I'll be there." Ashley, overhearing, smiled. "You know, Marcus, you've become part of our lives, part of this community. I hope you know how much that means to people." Tom added, "Before the storm, this town was dying. People were moving away, businesses closing. But now, there's this sense that we're all in it together, that we can handle whatever comes. You gave us that." Marcus shook his head. "I just gave you some tools and training. You did the rest." "Maybe," Tom said, "but you showed us it was possible. You showed us that caring about each other and being prepared aren't opposite things. They go together." On his way home that night, Marcus stopped at the cemetery for the first time since he'd moved to the mountains. He found a quiet spot under a pine tree and stood there, hands in his pockets, looking up at the stars. "I think I'm going to be okay," he said to Sarah and Daniel, to their memory, to the universe. "It took a long time, and I had to learn the hard way, but I think I finally understand. You didn't leave me with nothing. You left me with the capacity to love, to help, to care about others. I just forgot that for a while." The wind rustled through the pines, and Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Peace. Not the peace of isolation, not the peace of control, but the peace of acceptance. The peace of knowing that loss was part of life, but it didn't have to define life. The peace of understanding that the best way to honor the people you've lost is to live fully, to help others, to make the world a little better. The spring came early to the mountains that year, melting the massive snowpack faster than usual. Marcus worked with the town to prepare for potential flooding, implementing the same methodical approach he'd used for winter preparedness. The classes continued, evolving to cover different seasons, different emergencies. The town started a community supply depot, stocked with emergency equipment and supplies that anyone could access during a crisis. Marcus oversaw its creation, but he made sure it was managed by volunteers, that it belonged to everyone, not just him. One Saturday morning in late March, Marcus was helping set up the depot when a rusty pickup truck pulled up. An older man climbed out, weathered face, work-worn hands, eyes that had seen hard years. He walked directly to Marcus. "You Marcus Chen?" the man asked. "I am. Name's Walter Kane. I live up in Ridgeline, about 30 miles north. Heard about what you did here during the storm. Heard about these classes you're teaching." He paused, shifting his weight. "My town, we're smaller than this one, maybe 200 people. We got hit just as hard, but we didn't have anyone like you. We lost 3 people. Old Mrs. Henderson froze to death in her house. The Cortez boy got lost trying to walk to his grandmother's, didn't make it. And Jim Reeves, the hardware store owner, had a heart attack shoveling snow, couldn't get help in time." Marcus felt the weight of those words, the lives that might have been saved with knowledge, with preparation. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Walter nodded, his jaw tight. "We all are, but sorry doesn't bring them back. What might help is making sure it doesn't happen again. I came here to ask if you'd be willing to come to Ridgeline, teach us what you taught these folks. We can't pay much, but we'll pay what we can." Marcus looked at this man, at the grief and determination in his face, and saw himself reflected back. Someone trying to make meaning from loss, to prevent others from suffering the same pain. "I'll do it for free," Marcus said.
but I want something in return.
Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. What's that? I want you to train others after I teach you. I want Ridgeline to have its own emergency coordinator, its own prepared community. I can give you the knowledge, but you have to commit to building something that lasts. Walter extended his hand. Deal. Word spread. Over the following months, Marcus found himself traveling to neighboring communities, teaching the same lessons, watching the same transformation happen again and again. Towns that had been isolated, vulnerable, began to organize, to prepare, to connect with each other. A network began to form, communities helping communities, sharing resources and knowledge. The State Emergency Management Agency took notice. In early May, Marcus received a call from the director, a woman named Patricia Alvarez. Mr. Chen, I've been hearing remarkable things about the work you're doing. The town-by-town resilience building, the volunteer training networks, the community supply depots. It's exactly the kind of grassroots preparedness we've been trying to achieve for years. I'm just teaching people what I know, Marcus said. You're doing more than that. You're creating a model that could be replicated across the state, across the country even. I'd like to bring you on as a consultant to help us develop a statewide community preparedness program. Would you be interested? Marcus thought about it. Part of him wanted to say no, to stay small, to stay local. But then he thought about Walter Kane, about the 3 people in Ridgeline who'd died, about all the other small towns scattered across Colorado and beyond, that might face another storm without being ready. Yes, he said, but I have conditions. Patricia laughed. I expected you would. The program has to be community-based, not top-down. We train local coordinators who train their communities. We provide resources but respect local knowledge. And everything we develop has to be tested in real conditions by real people, not just look good on paper. I can work with that, Patricia said. When can you start? By the summer, Marcus found himself in a role he never could have imagined, traveling the state, speaking at conferences, helping small communities develop their own emergency preparedness programs. But he always came back to Pinewood Valley, always kept his cabin in the mountains, always made time for the classes at the community center. Because as much as his work had expanded, his heart remained rooted in the place and people who'd helped him remember how to live. Brett and Amber's baby was born in May, a healthy boy with a loud cry and his mother's eyes. They named him Marcus Brett Holloway, and when Marcus held him for the first time in the hospital, he cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense that life, despite everything, had a way of continuing, of creating new beginnings from old endings. Thank you, Brett said, watching Marcus cradle his son, for everything, for saving us, for teaching us, for showing us what strength really looks like. Marcus looked down at the tiny face, so new, so full of potential. Take care of him. Teach him to be prepared, but also teach him to care about others. Those 2 things together, that's what makes a good life. Emma's 10th birthday party was held at the community center, a raucous affair with half the town showing up. Marcus brought her a gift he'd made himself, a wooden toolbox, child-sized but sturdy, filled with real tools, a hammer, screwdrivers, a tape measure, a level. So you can build things, he explained when she opened it, her eyes going wide. Whatever you want to build. Emma hugged him fiercely. I want to build a cabin like yours someday, a place where people can be safe. Marcus felt his throat tighten. Then I'll teach you how. On a warm June afternoon, Marcus stood on his newly expanded porch. He'd added on to accommodate the visitors who now came regularly, and looked down at Pinewood Valley. The town looked different from how it had that first morning before the storm. The snow was gone, replaced by green grass and wildflowers. New construction was underway where damaged buildings were being rebuilt, this time with better insulation, backup heat sources, emergency plans. But more than the physical changes, there was an intangible difference. The town felt alive, connected, purposeful. People waved to each other on the street. Neighbors checked on neighbors. The community center was always busy with classes, meetings, gatherings, The storm had broken something, yes, but it had also built something. It had taken a dying town full of isolated individuals and forged them into a real community. And it had taken a broken man hiding from the world and given him a reason to rejoin it. Marcus heard a vehicle coming up his road and smiled. He knew that sound, Tom's truck. Sure enough, Tom pulled up with Ashley and Emma, all of them carrying baskets and bags. "We brought dinner," Ashley called. "Hope you don't mind company." "Never," Marcus said, and meant it. They set up on his new porch table, spreading out food while Emma chattered about school and her friends and a book she was reading. Other vehicles arrived, Sally and Frank with baby James, now chubby and laughing, David Park with his wife, even Brett and Amber with baby Marcus, who was sleeping peacefully in his carrier. Marcus looked around at all these people, his porch full of life and laughter, and felt a completeness he thought he'd lost forever. This wasn't the family he'd had, but it was a family nonetheless. A community he'd helped save, which had in turn saved him. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Emma leaned against Marcus's shoulder. "Mr. Marcus," she said quietly, "are you happy now?" He thought about the question, about the journey from that dark hospital waiting room 15 years ago to this moment, surrounded by people who cared about him, doing work that mattered, living instead of just surviving. "Yes," he said, surprised by how true it was. "Yes, I am." The conversation flowed around him. Tom and Brett discussing plans for a community workshop where they'd teach basic carpentry and home repair, Sally and Ashley organizing a neighborhood watch program that was really about checking on isolated residents, David talking about expanding the supply depot. Marcus listened, contributed when asked, but mostly just absorbed the warmth of being part of something. The food was simple but delicious. The laughter was genuine. The sense of belonging was something he'd thought he'd never feel again. As darkness fell and people began packing up to leave, each one stopped to thank Marcus for the evening, for the meal, for his friendship. It was the same ritual every time they gathered, as if they couldn't quite believe he was real, that he'd chosen to be part of their lives after so many years of isolation. After the last vehicle had driven away, Tom lingered behind, helping Marcus clean up. "You know," Tom said, wiping down the table, "I've been thinking about that first night when I showed up at your door half frozen, begging for help. I was so scared you'd turn me away. We'd all been pretty awful to you." Marcus stacked plates carefully. "You were desperate. People do what they need to do." "No, it was more than that. We'd judged you, mocked you, made assumptions, and you had every right to close that door in my face. But you didn't." Tom paused, his voice thick. "You saved my daughter's life, Marcus. You saved all of us. I don't think I'll ever be able to properly thank you for that." "You don't need to," Marcus said quietly. "Seeing Emma healthy, seeing your family together, seeing this whole community thriving, that's thanks enough." Tom nodded, then said something that had clearly been on his mind. "Ashley and I were talking. We know you lost your wife and son. We can't imagine that pain, but we want you to know that you're part of our family now. Emma already thinks of you as her uncle, and we'd be honored if you'd consider us family too." Marcus had to turn away for a moment, blinking hard against the sudden sting in his eyes. When he could trust his voice, he said, "I'd like that, very much." After Tom left, Marcus sat alone on his porch in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the mountain, crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, wind in the pines. But the silence didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt peaceful, comfortable, like the quiet between conversations with old friends. He thought about the state program he was helping build, about all the communities he was working with, about the lives that might be saved because people were learning to be prepared, to work together, to care for each other. The work was exhausting, often frustrating, but deeply meaningful. But he also thought about the simple joy of Emma's laughter, the weight of baby Marcus in his arms, the camaraderie of a shared meal with friends. Those moments mattered just as much, maybe more. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the mountain was quiet again, Marcus sat in his chair by the fire and pulled out the old photograph of Sarah and Daniel that he'd kept hidden for so many years. He looked at their faces, feeling love and loss and gratitude all mixed together. "Thank you," he whispered, "for the time we had, for the love you taught me, for the man you helped me become, even though it took me a long time to remember who that was." He placed the photograph on the mantel, no longer hidden but displayed, a reminder not of what he'd lost, but of what he'd learned. That love doesn't end with death. It transforms, becomes something else, something that can motivate us to be better, to help others, to live with purpose. Marcus pulled out a notebook and began writing, documenting the lessons learned from the storm, creating training materials for the state program, planning next steps. But every few minutes he'd pause and look up at that photograph, at Sarah's smile and Daniel's bright eyes, and feel their approval, their love, their presence still with him in a way he'd never allowed himself to feel before. The cabin creaked softly, settling, and Marcus smiled. This place that had been a fortress, a prison, a shelter, was now truly a home. Not because of its walls or systems or preparations, but because it had opened its doors and become part of something larger. Over the following year, Marcus watched the transformation continue, not just in Pinewood Valley, but across the region. The network of prepared communities grew, connected by relationships formed through shared training, mutual aid agreements, regular communication. When a wildfire threatened 3 towns the following summer, the response was coordinated, efficient, and effective. When a flash flood hit in the fall, neighboring communities had resources pre-positioned and volunteers trained to help. The state program Marcus helped develop became a national model. He was invited to speak at conferences, to consult with FEMA, to help other states develop similar programs. But he always declined the offers to relocate, to take a position in Denver or Washington. His work was here in these mountains with these people, because he'd learned something essential during that blizzard, that expertise without connection is sterile, that preparation without community is empty, that survival without purpose is just existence. On the first anniversary of the storm, Pinewood Valley held a memorial service at the community center. Not to mourn, everyone had survived, but to remember, to reflect, to honor what they'd learned. Marcus was asked to speak, and he stood before the assembled town, looking at faces he now knew by name, people he now counted as friends, a community he now belonged to. "A year ago," he began, "a storm came that tested all of us. It tested our preparations, our resilience, our will to survive. But more than that, it tested our assumptions about each other, about what it means to be part of a community." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I spent 15 years on that mountain, convinced that being prepared meant being isolated, that strength meant self-sufficiency, that the only person I could count on was myself, and I was wrong." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "The storm taught me that real preparation isn't just about having supplies or knowledge. It's about being ready to share them. Real strength isn't just about being able to survive alone. It's about being able to help others survive too. And real community isn't just proximity or convenience. It's a choice to care about each other, to support each other, to face whatever comes together." He looked at Emma, now 11 and growing tall, at baby Marcus, who was learning to walk, at all the children who would grow up in a town that was fundamentally different because of what they'd all been through. We lost no one in that storm, but we gained something. We gained each other. And that's worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth protecting. Thank you all for teaching me that lesson, for saving me just as much as I helped save you." The applause was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. He was looking at the faces around him, at the community they'd built together, at the future they were creating, and feeling something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope. Not the fragile hope of wishing things would be okay, but the solid hope of knowing that whatever came, they'd face it together. That preparation and community weren't opposite things, but 2 parts of the same essential truth. Marcus Chen had spent 15 years building a fortress to keep the world out. It took a storm, the worst blizzard in a century, to tear down those walls and remind him that the strongest shelter isn't built from logs and concrete and careful preparation. It's built from connection, from community, from the courage to care about something beyond yourself. He'd thought he was teaching the town about survival, but they'd taught him something far more important, that survival without connection is just existence, and existence without purpose is just marking time until it runs out. The mountain man who'd been mocked for his preparations had become the guardian who'd saved them all. But in doing so, he'd discovered that being prepared wasn't just about having supplies and knowledge. It was about having the heart to use them for others, the courage to engage instead of isolate, the wisdom to know that we're all in this together. Anyone can build walls to keep the world out, but it takes real strength to build bridges that let people in. Sometimes the greatest act of survival is learning to live again, to trust again, to love again, even after loss has taken everything. The storm had tested them all, but in the end, it had given them something more valuable than safety or comfort. It had given them each other. As the seasons turned and life in Pinewood Valley continued, Marcus Chen was no longer the isolated hermit on the mountain. He was Marcus, the emergency coordinator, the teacher, the neighbor, the friend, the honorary uncle, the godfather, the man who'd proven that preparedness and compassion weren't opposite things but two sides of the same essential truth, that we survive best when we survive together. And high on that mountain, in a cabin built for solitude but filled with purpose, Marcus finally understood what Sarah and Daniel had known all along, that a life lived for others is the only life worth living. That love doesn't end, it transforms. That loss doesn't have to define us, it can refine us. That the walls we build to protect ourselves can become the very things that imprison us, unless we have the courage to open the doors. The storm had given him back his life. The community had given him back his purpose. And in return, he'd given them the knowledge that they could face anything, survive anything, overcome anything, as long as they faced it together. That was the real lesson of the blizzard. Not that preparation matters, though it does. Not that knowledge is power, though it is. But that in the end, what saves us isn't what we have or what we know, but who we choose to be when others need us most. And Marcus Chen, the man who'd spent 15 years running from connection, had finally come home. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will inspire you. Click to keep discovering with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the greatest strength comes not from walls we build, but from the bridges we're brave enough to cross.